what I wanted to make sure I reiterate with the board and the community that in May of 2020, there were 551.7 FTEs, staff people. There is no 0.7 person, it's just how much they work. So you had 551.7. In November of 2021, we were down to 504.5. You'll see it fluctuate month to month, basically probably because of bus drivers or food service workers, not teachers or administrators. So part A there, 8.5% of the total staff was reduced with the 47.2 FTE reduction. 17.5 were transportation with your high school busing being cut. 17 was the teaching staff. And what I would say with the teaching staff there, I also heard a lot about, well, enrollment's down 200 or 300 kiddos. Why do you need the same amount of staff? And the answer is we don't. That's why the 17 FTEs, our class sizes, while our class sizes are still the second highest in Hamilton County, we're still getting it done in the classroom. But that was the adjustment for the enrollment that worked out. And then 4 FTEs in administration were cut. The day after the levy did not pass, I sat down and looked at what are we going to do. It's basically going to be with Gart Collier because it's people, right? That's where we're going to save some money. So there's going to be a hiring freeze for any additional positions. I wanted to make sure I put the caveat in there. Special education requirements like these 2 nurses, we can't do anything about. The staff reductions via retirements and or resignations, we've already got a list. We're going to look at that. Not replacing those. And I can tell you right now, the list that I have, when you don't replace those employees, we're getting into programming pretty deep. It's going to be programming for kids and what educational opportunities they have. So we've got a list of that we will move forward with. The cash balance, you heard a lot during the levy discussions about where's the cash balance. Well, the cash balance is going to go down. We've got a deficit spend. We're going to try and minimize our expenditures, try and drop that deficit as much as we can with expenditures. But when it's $3.6 million, that means we're going to be using cash balance to offset. How long that lasts, the 5-year forecast is going to let us know as well. So cash balance will be going down. The contingency fund will eliminate with the hopes that emergency funds are not needed. If emergency funds are needed, that means we're taking something else away and we're just not going to budget for the contingency funds. And the need for additional revenue, every discussion I had through the levy discussions was that's not going to go away. The additional need for additional revenue is something that will remain. You cannot cut yourself away from a deficit spend when you're looking at 90% of your budget being people. And so the additional revenue, what that looks like, I defer to the board. And Mr. Giuffre and I have had discussions, but I think that's what we're here for, is figuring out what next steps are and how we can not affect kids as much as possible, but it's going to affect kids where we're at now, and it's nothing that we haven't said before.
Good conversation this morning. I hope we're going to have a lot more. Some of what I have to say, I think is going to be a little difficult, but I think we've got to look at it. As I will, I've spent the week, a long week, I'll tell you, going over financial analyses and projections that keep bringing the gravity of what I think of as the looming problem home. And I'll get to some analytics in just a few moments. But I also want to say to the public that might be listening in or later on, that the school's financial position, no kidding around, really needs your attention. Our collective understanding, the board, the administration, the public, our collective understanding of the situation and the decisions that we'll be making down the road may have potentially significant ramifications on our community. The reality is that school funding and property taxes don't work in Ohio the way you would expect them to. And it's easy to misunderstand all kinds of important points. Along with that, it's hard to explain it all. And there's been a lot said, over the course of not just the last few months, but the last several years. Unfortunately, not all of it has been accurate. So please, all of you, please take this seriously. Don't be told how to think, ask difficult questions, be open-minded as you're engaging with each other. Please don't fall into disrespect of opposing viewpoints or vilification of others. We just don't get anywhere with that. This is a hard business problem and a community problem that's in front of us, and we can only solve this with good understanding and good intent. So please keep that in mind. As I say, make it a mission to find the truth, which sometimes is hard to get to because these are hard to understand subjects. I'd also say that there may be people who have been very supportive of our schools, but are financially challenged to show it with their checkbooks. To all of you, I say simply that I know you must make hard decisions that balance both your personal and your civic responsibilities. And I do think we all have civic responsibilities that are part of this conversation. You have to make those trade-offs within whatever your means are. Nevertheless, I appreciate your support of the school's mission, and I do that without any reservation whatsoever. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for what you try to do. That's not the problem here. There may also be people who are what I think of as ideologically opposed to public education. And to them, I say, please make sure that you are not painting our schools and teachers with concerns that you read about elsewhere in the country. Loveland is Loveland. It's not one of the places that's routinely out there making headlines because we are simply and entirely focused on just doing it right for our students. I would tell you again, I sit in the middle of a whole lot of conversations all year long, and I don't see what I read about. I'm not saying that there isn't something once in a while that comes up, but that's not descriptive of who we are. This is a right down the middle, care about the kids, do it right kind of environment. As I've been trying to explain throughout all of the Levy discussion, there are key facts that are widely misunderstood, but remain an undeniable background for the rest of this discussion. Based on the most recent data available, and I hope sometime in the next week or two, we'll see updated CUP reports. But based on the most recent data available, our schools are actually well controlled financially, costing 2.7% less per student than the average of all 607 school districts in the state. Yet get the highest performance ratings, higher than 595 other schools. These remain easily documentable facts. On the other hand, Loveland, from a resident's perspective, is also highly taxed, but not because of high school costs, rather the result of not having a lot of business to absorb some of the tax burden, along with low state funding driven by our very high average income and property values. The schools aren't the villain in this problem. I suggest when we go out and vote on police and fire levies, I don't think that we limit our decision to whether we personally might someday need their help. I think we also think about the day our neighbor or a neighbor's business might need that help. So we routinely provide all the funding. That's, I think, a fact. We provide all the funding they ask for. But that's the way communities work. And I'd argue the schools are no different. We're here every day to provide for any and every child as one of our most important community assets, and in fact, a pillar that Loveland is built on. Not only have these schools helped launch untold numbers of successful students into adulthood, but they are also the schools where the community comes together to help support kids with needs private schools don't address. It takes all of these assets together to make it work. And didn't know we were going to get into it, but we had a ton of discussion about that very aspect for the public schools earlier today. The tough message is that you get what you pay for. It's been a fantastic community built in part upon great schools. But that will inevitably change if the schools degrade from lack of reasonable funding. Yes, we must find ways to stretch our dollars and doing as little long-term harm as we can going forward. A lot of my comments will be about this. But it is a progressive problem. The longer we go without reasonable tax revenue, the more damaging this process of stretching becomes. We've heard some of this already today, but there are already families who struggle to get their kids to the high school. And some of those are the ones whose futures are most challenged. And I, for one, and I think I'm not alone in this, can't let go of the need to fix things like that. I don't know how to fix them right now, but I can't just say, forget about it. We are now moving into the 9th year of relatively fixed tax revenue. 9 years. Doing exactly the same things, having exactly the same teachers and staff, exactly the same programs, exactly the same buildings to maintain. Our costs rise relentlessly each year as inflation has its way. The cumulative effect of 9 years of fixed revenue is literally pounding at the door. So I have spent a lot of time. I want to share something with you. On the screen, I think this is getting broadcast as well. And it's good. Okay, so this is a chart that I've shared at least an earlier version of at the 2 previous board meetings. And what I've done here is to just take publicly available data off of Rob's, either Rob's website or Board Docs. And I think I went back 52 months and I go forward, I want to say maybe something like 48 individual months, analyzing our monthly disbursements and our monthly revenue. And if you look at this period over here, let me get this pulled up a little bit higher. Basically, up until November is actual data. All this, right? And we go up and we go down, and that's the literal effect of what we've talked about a number of times. Big tax payments from the county arriving twice a year. So our balance goes way up. And then we live off of that for give or take the next 6 months. And we pay out something like $4.5 million or so per month in running the district. And the vast majority of that, as we've said, is wages and benefits. But it goes up and it goes down. The $14 million number that got thrown around so much last year is such a distraction from what the real picture is, that it's a little dangerous to focus on that, because it's not about that. What it's really about is how long does a balance last, and how low does it get before you get a new check deposited into the account. So you'll see here a couple of colored lines. The yellow line represents an average of 60 days of our disbursement. So basically 2 months worth of payments. That's a threshold that many treasurers in the state tend to use as a guideline to don't fall below that, because you don't know what happens later on. The red line is 30 days. And that's when things get super touchy, because you don't know where you're going to have the money, when you're going to have to write checks. Violating the red line is maybe a situation where you can't write checks because you don't have the cash in the bank. It wiggles a little bit because it's both of those lines wiggle a little bit because, as opposed to the last time I showed this to you, these are now built on 6-month moving averages. So they update based on what the trend of expenses or revenues are. The dotted line in here is my attempt to factor back in ESSER. And this would be the ESSER that would be kind of associated with employees that are going to stay here tomorrow. If you were seeing the expense, which is hidden because it's charged to the ESSER account, if you were seeing it, the cash balance wouldn't be up here, it'd be more like down here. Okay, so that's kind of the history. Then we get to the future. And what I've done over here, and this is a different approach than Rob's 5-year forecast. This is my forecast, and it's far simpler. In a lot of ways, it's far less arguable because all I've really done is to take our historical true expense load, that's sort of adjusted now, true expense load, and say that reasonably it's going to increase by some percentage. The percentage can be an arguable one, and I'll talk about it more in a second. But I've also done the same thing with revenue. And in this particular model at the moment, it's a higher number than I normally use. But to make it foot to Rob's revenue projections, which I don't think are really arguable, it's about 1.25 points growth per year in revenue. And that's largely attributable to new homes and sales, but the core doesn't really change very much. The rate of growth that I've factored in here right now is 4.6%. And that's essentially what Rob had built into the forecast going forward. Higher than I would normally like to use. And then I tore into where did you get that number from? And it's largely a blending of expected salary increases, something maybe in the 3.5% kind of range, with benefit increases that are substantially higher. I want to say it's more like 5.5%. And the blend of those two yields something close to this 4.6. So, we can argue that 4.6 is a good growth rate or not. The problem with it is, as we were talking about earlier, we have contracts that are due this year, and we don't know where all of that is going to go. So this is the most sensitive part of the model. Changing that a little bit can change the flow of cash fairly significantly. But for the moment, let me stay at the 4.6. And
can I just ask
yes,
a quick
please.
question, Kevin? Yeah. Does that 4.6 also take into an attempt for things other than benefits to be at the 3 to 3.5 level? In other words, there aren't other things in there that are above, because that has been our attempt of recent years, is to stay at or below that level.
If you look at his 5-year forecast, he'll have, I don't know, maybe 3, 4, 5 pages in there, separate pages on different categories of expenditures. And you'll see that in those other categories, he doesn't have anything really close to this.
Okay.
Right. So they're generally far less. This is really being driven by wages and also benefits. And again, you can argue about the wages. I think we've got a pretty good handle on the benefit situation. Maybe we could take a bet and say we're not going to see 3.5% of wage. Maybe we'll see something less than that, but you don't know. So for the moment, I'm running with the 4.6 with everything else, and I can change it on the fly here if you want to see
I just want
the
to make
effect
sure
of it.
that
Right? What starts to happen here, and so I've used, let's see, make this set up right so you can see it properly. As opposed to fiscal years, I've put these blue vertical lines to outline calendar years. And the reason I did that is that, effectively the revenue that we get to talk about is on a calendar year. So 23 is done. There's no, at least levy revenue to be had incrementally in 23. It is what it is. And then I allow elsewhere in the model, if we want to play with it, what happens if we had this much of a millage or that much of a millage? How does it change this picture at different points in time? But what this says at the 4.6 rate of expense growth is that we get pretty close to the caution line at the end of this year, really the first of 24, pretty close. This is largely what we've been saying, that 2023 isn't an emergency, but it's starting to become a problem. And the real problem shows up shortly thereafter. And you can see what happens down here, that we're in danger of breaching the red line by the end of 24. So 23 was get ready, try to solve this problem before it becomes a problem, because now we're kind of up against the wall here. If we don't solve it during the course of 23, and therefore realize revenue in 24, which is the first time we would realize it, right? 24 looks really pretty yucky, and I'll show you what we have to do to fix that.
Right.
Okay.
And 23 looks like that. Apart from any reduction in expenses
Not yet.
or addition of funds, because
Correct.
funds cannot come till 2024. So doing nothing in 2023 is what gets us
Correct.
there.
And that's the point of the model now, that first it demonstrates what really happens with cash. This is the real world, what really happens with cash over the course of time. And then once you know that there is what I called my opening comment, a looming problem, you have an obligation to do something about it. And right now, I'd argue all you can do, well, I'll take you through 10 things I think we can do, but let's say for the most part, you got to save some money in order to preserve your ability to stay in business going forward. You can talk about new revenue in 23, but you won't see it until 24. Okay, so over here, down in this little area, this area over here, this is what I call austerity reductions. And it's not intended to be saying that you have to do this entirely through wages and benefits, but I do translate it to wages and benefits. The reality is you wouldn't do it through just one tactic, you would do it through an array of tactics, okay? And I'll save a little bit of time. You can tell me try different things, but I've been playing with it enough, and I have some suggestions here to get us started. So I'm uncomfortable not doing anything in 23, because if I don't do anything in 23, I have to do it all in 24, and it becomes very, very painful to do it in 24. Eric, you
Sorry, I apologize for saying, when you say I'm uncomfortable doing anything in 23, were you talking about decreasing expenses, increasing revenues, or both? And I'm
quite
talking about
literally both.
Okay.
Quite literally both. Although I think that the practical thing is that you have more control over expenses than you do over revenues.
well, the only way to increase revenues marginally or significantly is through a levy.
Significantly, yeah. There's some other things that maybe you could do, but how material they turn out to be is,
Especially in a short time period.
right, you don't know. All right, so let me say, for the sake of argument, that Mike targets 2% reduction in 23. That moves them. It's this blue line now has moved comfortably off the yellow line, right? The reddish orange line is what it was before. Okay, so a 2% reduction just gives us a little bit of comfort in 23. It equates to about $1 million worth of savings, worth of reductions. If you were to do it entirely through teachers, because I think Mike would argue that he can't do it through bus drivers. He needs every bus driver he can get. And if you did do it through bus drivers, the state would have something to say to us about us failing our transportation imperatives. So it's not really an option. But $1 million, I might argue, on the average, is about 9 teacher FTEs. 9. And it really is more than that, because that's at the average. And because if we did get into forced reductions in headcount, that works on seniority. So the newest teachers who are earning the least amount of money are the first to go. And therefore, 9, if you were doing it this way, and I don't recommend you do it exactly this way, but 9 might become 12 or 15 or something like that. And to put that in perspective, 9 would represent 4% of the workforce coming out. Okay, It still doesn't solve our problem in 24. So let's say that we did that now and we started to bank a little bit of cushion in 23, and a levy goes up either in the early part of 23 or the later part of 23, and it fails. So now you have to deal with a much more significant problem in 24. And to cure that one, let's see here if this works. 4% doesn't do it. Let me try 5%. 5% doesn't quite do it. Let me try 6%. Yeah, okay, so 6% is roughly what you need to get back above the caution area. And shockingly,
I'm sorry, Kevin, you're talking about there's a 2% cut in 23 and then a 6% cut in
so these are
24.
now cumulative. I'm sorry, you have to add them together.
Right.
So we had 9 in 23, we would have 30 in 24. We're up to 39. Again, you know, some of this you wouldn't do, and some of this is actually worse than what I'm showing, right? Because of the averages, and you're going to go on seniority, so the least expensive people go first. But you're
And
not
that
only,
And not to, I don't want to derail anything, but the actual 23, if there were cuts in staff, would only be half of that year. Because it
probably so.
wouldn't happen until, but that won't
Probably so.
significantly
Right. Right.
affect the
Right.
graph.
So if you, yeah, excellent point. If I did this from a, what would you actually do kind of perspective? When could you actually do it? I'd actually have to have 4% up there instead of 2
Okay,
in order to
thanks,
get the full year impact that I'm
you.
showing. Right.
thanks.
But now, as I think I was starting to say, you're up to 15% of the workforce. And God forbid, if we can't get it done in 24 for 25, what do I have to do then? I think I did this one already. I think it takes, no, 7.5 doesn't do it. 8. Let me try to 10 here. Let me stop there.
Yeah.
Because this is getting
Stop
crazy.
there.
It's getting crazy, right? But I'm now at, 82, 90, 91 headcount reductions. And I think Mike would argue we fall apart at that level.
Well, you've reduced by a third, correct?
Your
You've reduced
your
Yeah,
teaching
we have
staff.
reduced it by 34% by that point, right? So what I'm just demonstrating here is that the problem is cumulative. It's very real. You have to do something about it. So again, if we got lucky or fortunate, let me say, and we didn't have 4.6% growth up here, and it turns out to be something less than that, this is not so draconian. It's still not pretty, but it's an easier situation.
So can you demonstrate
yeah,
that?
do you mind
Yeah,
putting
so
that
let me
to
put
3.5
in there.
right,
Okay.
3.5
Let me
or 3 or whatever you pick it.
let me put 4 in there. So things, you can see everything gets healthier with significantly healthier than, so we don't need these levels of reductions. So let me go back to these being 0, and I'll keep the 2% in 23, just because I know that 24 is still a problem. But instead of, what did I do before, at 4 or 5%?
It was 4.
And so now, let me see if maybe 3%.
Well, you had 6 there
would do
before.
it.
Oh, it's
6.
6.
Yeah.
Okay, so, I've kind of cut it in half here. So instead of it being 6, I can get okay at 3%. So I'm at 24 headcount cumulatively by that point in time. If I was able to achieve the 4.0, which is me saying, 3.5 on wages, and then, I got to deal with the benefit problem, and it's a bad benefit cost year, so I have to deal with that. Maybe I can get to 4. Who knows?
I know this is hard because of the ESSER fluctuations we've had recently, but what has been our historical rate of growth?
I do. I have it here, Eric. I don't know if I'm prepared to,
That's okay. You don't necessarily, because my understanding is
I want to say it's in the fours.
right, it's less than we have projected, but not
Correct.
dramatically less than we have
Correct.
projected in our
And
current
again,
5-year budget.
A good deal of the first year, well, let me explain it this way. You got a very, in Rob's forecast, you've got a very significant 23 forecast. There are two things that work there fundamentally. One is that he loads the contingency in there, which is, he's really worked hard to try to explain this. And I'm really beginning to understand more clearly what he's saying. It's not a cash item until you actually spend it.
Right.
But he's reserving that room in there. So in this analysis, I've taken it all out. And I've said, what happens, right? If we get slammed with, a whole bunch of mandatory expenditures, we just got, it'll be what it is. We have no reserve for it. So I've just taken that out, and that's a good chunk of his increase. The rest of it is coming off of the ESSER.
Right.
Absorption of expenses. And I think that probably explains the majority of that steep rise. And then he comes back down to something that's more modest in the subsequent years. It's kind of interesting. I end up pretty close in the out years to his level of annual disbursements, doing it my way as he does. So he may be off. I don't think he's, dramatically off.
I agree with you. And I think that the problem with the contingency thing was just the fact of its introduction and that it was different than it was before. So it always
Right.
raised questions, but essentially it accounted for some of the cash that we already had. Instead of
Right.
just taking it out of your cash balance,
Right.
it came out of this part of
Right.
the budget.
Uh,
But it's the same, we've had this conversation. It's the same money either way.
Right, so here I did allow room to plug in some levy numbers. I don't know if you want to try some of those and see how they change things, but
The part of the conversation that we get away from, and I had a slide up there, is that bottom number of 9, that bottom number has already been 47 a couple of years ago.
Right.
And you cut 9, you cut 15, are you cutting your way out of this deficit?
oh, you're just delaying
Yeah.
it.
No.
still-
So
Right.
this graphically proves the point. You're gonna have to cut 15 people a year just to maintain. And that's where the additional revenue, as reasonable as possible, is what you need. But I just
You know,
want
I
to,
mean,
Well, the alternative to maintain is just nobody gets any raises forever.
correct,
And obviously I'm exaggerating to prove the point, but again, then you never get a new teacher to come to Loveland again.
right, if you stopped it right now, I can put, 0% growth in there. And you'll see that we're okay.
Right.
But that's not the real world, right?
Guarantee a strike.
The economy doesn't
Right.
work that way, so.
If I can just say, Kevin, I don't know, I mean, I do know, but I don't know exactly how much time you're thinking left. You suggested putting in levy numbers. We're at 11:11
Okay,
now.
let me,
So I just want to make sure that
Right.
there's time for what you want to present
let me do the
and
rest of
make
it.
sure there's time for what people want to ask about.
If
Obviously, we're not going to come to a conclusion today,
Right.
but I want to make sure that everybody gets their
Right.
information.
To me, this is
I'm-
really helpful way to craft unless, because I don't have any additional things, so this
Right.
is.
Okay, I just
Good
want to make
place to
sure
start.
that we all knew where we were
I'm
time
not a
wise.
fan of talking about levies today.
Well, I would like to,
I
I
really
understand,
want to talk about the real world right now.
where you're coming from, but just to give us an idea of like, so 2023, you're
Is
gonna
done.
show input in 2024.
Actually, I
How is
apply
your
it to
model
the
set?
current year.
Okay, gotcha.
So if you wanted me to put in a 4.9
Right.
to, I would put it in the 2024 cell.
Well, just throw in, I don't care what you throw in. I put 4.9. So this is what we had asked for in November.
So
And
we
what
come
does that
off,
do? Right.
We come off caution pretty well.
Is this
Um,
26?
That is,
Oops.
Oh, sorry.
that is 26.
Click a note.
25, 26 school year.
Click that.
Sorry.
Oh, wait, actually, I think it's me.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
here.
Where is it?
I think it's you.
So wait, so I make sure the blue line is what now and the
The
orange?
blue line is adjusted.
With this.
The
with
red line
cuts.
is
With no cuts.
with no cuts. So the blue line represents 2% and 3% reductions in 23, 24. And it represents
Now,
a 4.9 levy only in 24.
And the red line was what it would have been without any of this.
Correct.
Got it.
No, the 4.9 levy only in 24. Okay, gotcha.
And I
But
really
that-
should put it
you
in
should put it in
25
25 and 26 as well.
Right.
Okay.
So let me go ahead and do
All right.
that. So that all
Alright.
comes up off the
Got it.
line, right?
Got it.
What this doesn't show, because it doesn't go out far enough,
It doesn't show
It's
our
the life of the
increasing,
levy.
well, it also doesn't show our increasing costs, I think.
well, they're still in there.
Okay.
I mean, you can see
We're
here,
down-
Oh, yeah,
We're
okay,
down to the
That's-
4% growth rate.
this is a little lower cash than that is.
okay, I'm with you.
That's, again, inflation having its way. So if you were to put a levy in of 4.9 for these 3 years, and I had stretched this thing out a few more years, eventually you would see us back down on the yellow line.
Well, and again,
What's-
just to go on, oh, don't touch it.
You still have the 9 and 15 in there,
Correct.
just.
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, and again, the problem in part is that 23 is essentially in the books.
Right.
It's
Right.
done. The only thing you can do is just kind of drive the expense load down and give yourself a little bit of cushion.
So if you take the
for
24 austerity reduction out.
Yep. Coming up.
That's, yeah.
Right.
And I think the biggest thing that's always frustrating but true to me is that cutting FTEs, you've gotten rid of your least expensive
That's the real
employees.
problem.
And then if somebody goes, why are you paying your teachers so much? Well,
Right.
you just drove out all the expensive ones.
Your
We're like,
averages actually will come
Go
up
up.
as you do that.
And to keep going back to Mike's point, we've cut employees to the point where cutting employees, any employees, whether it's the 9, 10, 11 here, is dangerous. It's not like we
Right.
have a lot of employees to
Yeah.
cut at this point.
Yeah.
You have really begun to cut into what is needed. I think at one point, Mike made a point of, if you cut, you're beginning to affect the safety of our students. You're beginning to not just affect their academic growth, but you're beginning to affect the actual safety of our students.
Right. So if you're okay, you've gotten a fundamental message here. Let me make a few other comments and then we can just chat.
We've gotten the message that Kevin has a really cool toy.
Yeah,
That if I'm just. that
do
was
me,
not
I'm sorry,
nice.
that's, do
It's
me
a
a
very
favor,
important tool,
ju-
but it's.
just to graphically represent this, and I hate to take this time because I know we don't have a lot left.
No.
Change the 4.9 to 3.
3 even.
Yeah.
3, 3, and 3.
Okay.
Gives you a little bit of life.
And this is an example of what we've been saying all along as well. The 4.9, you can stretch, so you can get years and continue to manage the way we're managing. As that number goes down, then the length of,
Right.
it's just common sense.
Okay, so again, if you're okay, let me.
Yep.
Let me stop sharing this. And then I've got a few other things to say, which is kind of built on experience with the world that I'm familiar with, of having actually done some of this stuff. Yeah, as a matter of fact. So I said last month that we wouldn't like what fixing the funding shortfall would look like. Remember me saying that?
Right.
Well, there's more to come here. Depending on how long the lack of new funding persists, reality is that, and you started to internalize it just now, we will be overseeing the disassembly of the district, a little bit at a time, until something changes. This isn't always clear to everybody, but make no doubt, once we start this, we don't have complete control over where it goes. And the reasoning on that is that this is a real people business. I mean, this is, kind of what I did for a living. This is a real people business. And we need to account for the impact. This is, what Mike's been trying to tell us. Account for the impact of everything we do on its human beings. People react to circumstances. Lack of new funding, now closing in on, I'm going to say it, almost a decade. I was asking my daughter, what grade she
Yeah.
was in 2014. And I think she was a junior in high school, she said. Long time ago. Almost a decade of this will result this is not fear mongering, this is human nature, right? Will result in employees taking control of their futures and getting out from under the dark cloud of uncertain community support, negativity, the inevitable decline in employment stability, income growth, and maybe more importantly than everything, a clear, exciting future. What can I see down the road? Many of you, all of us, I think, have found ourselves in similar situations at some point in our lives. We've kind of touched on this, but the hard, largely unnoticed work that's gone into restructuring our union contracts will actually become meaningless as the young new talent we've hired and plan to get hired with new salary scales will leave either on their own for more positive settings. When people have options, they take them.
Well,
Is what really happens in the world.
Kevin, I don't want to interrupt too much, but you hit the nail on the head. The mobility of teachers is highest in their first 7 years.
Right.
So we act as the training ground for other districts
Right.
who come in and then they move on to someplace else with a
Right.
rosier
Well,
picture.
and what I also found with we were Wittenberg and we were freezing salaries is you also lose of that cohort, you lose your most talented of that
Right.
cohort because they're the most mobile.
I mean, to put it kind of bluntly, they don't need this. They don't need all this stuff, right? Because
Yeah.
they were very desirable young employees when we hired them. If this is going to be a really nasty environment, I can go someplace else. I've got no ties to the community. I've got no ties because I have no pension build up or anything else going on here. I just go someplace else where they're going to love me, take care of me, and I'll have a great future.
It also
I don't need
affects,
the drama anymore.
yeah, it affects your hiring practice that we've tried to instill, which is we get the best and the brightest right now. So we can hire at a lower,
So they either leave on their own, or as we've been talking a little bit about here, they may eventually end up being part of a forced seniority-based reduction plan. People leaving a bad situation, I think we have to be realistic about it. Leaving a bad situation isn't limited to staff. It's likely that we're going to see the same thing with families who leave the schools or even the community. I know we've been told some of these already, in search of more stable alternatives. The resulting increased burden, think about this one, because I don't think we talk about it at all, but the resulting increased burden on the private schools in our geography with increasing enrollment because parents don't want to be a part of this potential mess either. If I can afford it, I'll go over to the private schools, but the private schools don't have unlimited capacity. So I don't know what it would actually look like, but I wouldn't be surprised that you end up with waiting lists and supply and demand takes over and tuition grows and all that kind of stuff. In any event, there's unforeseen impacts on that side of it. And people may not realize it, but I think all of us at this table have been talked to by other folks who are talking about our growing reputation for not being able to support the schools. It's becoming noticed. And it's one of the things that all of us should be concerned about. I think with its inevitable impact on the desirability of Loveland and our collective property values. So I do think, and again, I'm not trying to be an alarmist. I'm just saying, after a decade of this kind of stuff, and you start to see real impacts, there are consequences, and you can't walk away from this stuff. Loveland will look different. So I think the future is very difficult if these funding problems continue much longer. Again, the beauty of having it come up this past November is that it didn't create an emergency. We have time to talk about it and think about what can we possibly still yet do. I continue to urge we try everything to push off forced headcount reductions. To me, that's almost the end of the line. While we work with the community to solve for reasonable funding options and avoid all these issues I've been talking about. I've put together a quick list of 10 possible areas so far for an austerity strategy until our future funding picture improves. These are roughly in order of decreasing desirability. Right? Easy first, kind of terrible at the end. And a number of these Mike has already talked about. I've been talking to Mike and Rob for some time about all these things, and I was delighted to hear that they're already thinking about a number of them. All right, so first on the list is direct the treasurer to revise our investment strategy as needed to maintain needed liquidity. In other words, we've got investment instruments, bonds, et cetera. No focus on investment, focus on liquidity. We don't want you to liquidate a bond and pay a penalty on it unless things get really, really bad. But in the meantime, as they mature, take the cash, bank it, and cash is king. So do what you have to do. Mike talks a lot about the $3.6 million spending deficit. I'm going to say embrace part of that deficit. Don't try to solve it all at once, because I showed you basically $1 million of savings, and we don't like that. $3.5 million of savings, which would kind of maintain our cash balance for a much, much longer period of time, is going to be really, really nasty. So accept a degree of cash balance reduction, buy into it, but set up our budgets to target 60-day minimum cash on hand as we look at the year. Figure out what that's going to take to get. I mean, this is Kevin's work. Rob really needs to do it and figure out it, and Mike, working with the staff, I think, figure out in very detail how can you get $1 million or something like that to protect us right now. Adopt a policy, and he's already done this. I'm just calling it a policy now. Adopt a policy of voluntary force reduction until new funding provides reasonably secure stability. So it's not a rule, it's policy, which means that if he has retirements and resignations in the past, he might have shuffled the deck and I might have used a headcount from here for somebody that I needed over here. Now take the net reduction, right? Unless you cannot handle it. Say, for example, you lose a physics teacher, and it's a very specialized kind of thing, and you actually need to go out and hire the physics teacher. You just have to do some things. Okay, fine. But from a directional perspective, allow voluntary departures to inch us down, because every one of those is one that we don't have to force later on. Number 4, direct, hopefully we haven't seen it yet. I keep talking about it, but we haven't seen it yet. The new TIF revenue when it arrives from Sims Township, which is maybe in the $400,000 a year range, to operations, day-to-day operations. But this is the twist on it. Keep it visible as possible future funding for reinstatement of high school busing. If we can get our way through funding the day-to-day business or an eventual levy, whatever, this is money that can pretty much cover the cost of bringing back high school busing and maybe keep it out of any levy request down the road. But for now, cash is king. We need to push it towards paying the bills, and we'll see if things can change later on. That's not a reality yet, right? We're told this is coming, but we've been working on it for over a year. So we'll have to see. Examine the potential, this is number 5, examine the potential for a 501c3 to accept community contributions and direct those monies to district operations. So this is go to the community. We had one community member say, I'd like to donate what I would have paid in incremental property taxes back to the district. Great sentiment. Not everybody will do that, but set up a fund that hopefully would make it tax deductible for them, but be able for us to use it for day-to-day operations. I don't know if the tax implications of that are as clear as I just easily said they would be. We have to work through that. But that's kind of going out to the community and saying, voluntarily, give us a hand.
Is that something that's, no matter whether we were talking about austerity measures, levies, is that something that is long-term?
I don't think so. Well, worth it, is another story. I was going to say, I don't think it's long-term viable.
Okay.
But helpful for sure. And the reason I say I'm not sure it's viable is if we establish this thing based on our current need and in lieu of property taxes, right? And eventually property taxes, the levy is approved. I think you'll find a lot of people saying, okay, well, I'm going to just pay for my property taxes. I'm not going to make contributions to the 501c3 anymore. I think there's other things that we can do with the foundation, et cetera. But my experience, and I've worked a lot with Xavier, and I've worked with Easter seals on fundraising kinds of things. People are willing to invest big money. These wealthy people are willing to invest big money, but a lot of times they want their name on something.
So that's what was my point, was
Right.
that is completely outside
Correct.
of the notion of the foundation. It's
Correct.
very
I
specific.
think so.
Okay.
I think so. This is targeted, and then again, this is from the fundraising exposure that I've had with two, kind of significant institutions in the area and working with their professional fundraising people. Getting folks to spend money on operations is much, much harder than getting them to, build a building or
Right.
some such thing. So that's just the reality of it. Maybe we'd find that we had a different outcome. I don't say, certainly we need to pursue everything, but just be realistic in what our expectations are on things like this. Number 6 on my list is develop a non-personnel savings plan, essentially scrubbing every non-employee expenditure item in the budget for reduction. Things like, fixed assets that have to be replaced. Hold on to the Chromebooks for another year. Normally, we don't like to spend good money after bad, but when cash is king, you got to do what you got to do. I used a little bit the example of letting the grass grow longer. To me, it's no kidding around. If we mow the lawn every week, make it every other week or every 3 weeks. Save dimes wherever you can save dimes. Individually don't matter a lot, unfortunately, but you do enough of those, maybe you save a head count or two or something like that at the end of the day. This gets even more disagreeable now. Examine potential for fee escalations. More disagreeable yet, examine potential for non-bargaining unit employee salary freezes. We don't get to do that with the bargaining units, but we can potentially do it, and it'll be an extremely unpopular move with the staff. But if you're trying to stay alive, sometimes you've got to do unpopular things. Number 9 on the list is if all else fails, now you go to involuntary reduction in force strategies. Now, because we've tried everything, it's deeper in the year, we hadn't got a levy passed, et cetera, et cetera. We have to go where the real money is, and that's unfortunately human beings. And we pay a price for that. Number 10, and only a few of you know that I've been thinking about this, but begin exploration of what in the business world we would call strategic alternatives. In the business world, when you're out of options, you start thinking about throwing it all up in the air and looking to change the fundamental nature of your business. And that can mean potentially re-architecting the district, merging with another district, things of that nature. I've done a little bit of legal research on it. I understand a little bit about what it would take. It's certainly plausible to do such a thing. It's relatively unheard of. There have to be some benefit for a partner that we would bring to the party. I tend to think about these in terms of logistics. And do we have a school building that really better physically aligned with a neighboring district, and it can work for them? We bring a lot of, I don't want to say this the wrong way, but we bring a lot of baggage to the party. And in the merger world, somebody's got to love you in order to marry you. So we may not be so lovable at the moment, but I don't think that should, you can't pass a levy, et cetera, right? So somebody else going to inherit this problem and what have you. Those become problematic elements, but I don't think if we get to this level of concern that we should rule out kind of very significant kinds of changes like that. So the cash situation will deteriorate at an increasing pace going forward. You can see that. The plan I laid out, though, is progressive, allowing us to see if we can secure funding to prevent going deeper into the list and escalating the reductions. The longer we wait, however, the bigger the issue becomes. So I think, as I've been saying, action in 23 is wise to help limit the impact on 24, where the issues clearly become much more severe. That's, it gets worse increasingly over time. The lack of new revenue over multiple years will cause major issues. So, and I mean, you can see eventually we're way down in the red if this thing continues much longer. So we need to make sure that the public understands the gravity of the problem. Maybe it's not so bad at the moment, but bad is kind of around the corner.